Tonight we begin with something most people never really think about. Where exactly did criminals go before there were prisons? Before steel bars and concrete cells? Before the modern penitentiary system we know today? Because for most of human history, locking someone up for years wasn't the punishment. It was just the waiting room. Picture this. You're a thief in ancient Rome. You've just been caught stealing bread from the marketplace. The guards drag you before a magistrate who barely looks up from his scroll. You're expecting a trial, maybe a debate, perhaps some legal maneuvering. Instead, he announces your punishment immediately. You'll be flogged in the public square tomorrow morning. Your hand will be branded, and if you're lucky, that's the end of it. No jail time, no cell, no years of confinement. Just immediate, often brutal, and very public consequences. Then you're released back into society, marked, humiliated, and expected to never do it again. For thousands of years, this was how justice worked. Punishment wasn't about rehabilitation or containment. It was about pain, shame, and spectacle. Societies didn't have the resources, infrastructure, or frankly the interest in housing criminals long term. Keeping someone fed and guarded for months or years was expensive. It required buildings, personnel, and logistics that most communities simply couldn't afford. So instead, they got creative, very creative, and often disturbingly efficient. Ancient civilizations understood one thing clearly. If you wanted to deter crime, you made the consequences immediate and unforgettable. A flogging in the town square sent a message to everyone watching. Branding a thief's forehead told the world what he'd done. Cutting off a hand ensured he'd never forget. These weren't just punishments. They were warnings etched into flesh, performed in public, designed to make the crowd think twice before committing the same crime. But where did prisoners actually go while awaiting these punishments? Because trials, executions, and floggings couldn't always happen instantly. Someone had to hold the accused somewhere. And that's where things get interesting. Because the places used to hold prisoners before modern jails were improvised, temporary, and often nightmarish. Dungeons, pits, cages, abandoned towers, even private homes. Anything that could contain a body until the real punishment arrived. Medieval Europe, for example, rarely imprisoned people as the punishment itself. Instead, dungeons beneath castles and fortresses served as holding cells. Dark, damp, freezing spaces carved into stone where prisoners waited for trial, execution, or ransom. These weren't correctional facilities. They were storage, human storage. The goal wasn't reform. It was simply to keep someone from running away until the Lord, King, or Judge decided their fate. And the conditions, utterly brutal. No sunlight, no ventilation, often no toilet beyond a hole in the floor or a bucket that was emptied, if you were lucky, once a week. Prisoners sat in their own filth, chained to walls, surrounded by rats, lice, and the slow creeping certainty that they might die here long before their official punishment arrived. Disease spread rapidly, infections festered, and guards, underpaid and indifferent, rarely intervened unless a prisoner was important enough to ransom. In ancient Greece, the situation was similarly bleak. The Athenians, who prided themselves on democracy and philosophy, had surprisingly little patience for long-term incarceration. Their legal system preferred immediate resolution, fines, exile, execution, or public shaming. If you committed a serious crime, you didn't sit in a cell for years contemplating your mistakes. You faced consequences within days, sometimes hours, but they did have holding spaces, small stone chambers, often underground, where accused criminals awaited trial. Socrates, the great philosopher, famously spent his final days in one such Athenian prison. Not because imprisonment was his sentence, but because he was waiting for execution. His cell was a temporary holding space, a place to reflect, argue with visitors, and ultimately drink the hemlock that ended his life. The prison didn't punish him. It simply delayed his death long enough for the legal formalities to conclude. In ancient Egypt, justice was swift and often theatrical. Pharaohs and local governors dispensed punishments with little delay. Thieves might have their noses or ears cut off. Murderers faced execution. Traitors were impaled or fed to crocodiles. The Egyptians saw no value in warehousing criminals. Punishment was immediate, visible, and irreversible. Yet even Egypt needed temporary holding spaces. Prisoners awaiting trial or execution were sometimes kept in makeshift cells. often little more than pits dug into the ground and covered with wooden grates. Guards stood watch, not to prevent escape, which was nearly impossible from a pit, but to ensure the prisoner didn't die before their official punishment, because dying prematurely robbed the state of its spectacle, and spectacle mattered. Public punishment reinforced order, reminded citizens of consequences, and demonstrated the pharaoh's power. The ancient Hebrews had their own approach. Mosaic law outlined specific punishments for specific crimes. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Justice was transactional and immediate. But the Bible also mentions imprisonment, though rarely as punishment itself. Joseph was thrown into Pharaoh's prison in Egypt, not as a sentence, but as a holding pattern while authorities figured out what to do with him. Jeremiah the prophet was imprisoned in a cistern, a deep well where he sank into the mud and nearly died. Again, not as formal punishment, but as a crude, improvised way to silence him temporarily. These cisterns, wells, and pits became common improvised prisons throughout the ancient world. They required no construction, no guards, beyond someone watching the opening, and no maintenance. You simply dropped a prisoner into a hole and left them there. If they survived until their trial or punishment, fine. If they didn't, well, problem solved. Medieval Japan took a different approach. The samurai code emphasized honor, loyalty, and swift justice. Criminals faced beheading, crucifixion, or exile. But before execution, they were sometimes held in wooden cages barely large enough to sit in, displayed publicly so the community could see them, mock them, and internalize the consequences of breaking the law. These cages weren't designed for long-term use. They were temporary stages for humiliation before the final act. In medieval China, justice was equally brutal and immediate. The legal system under various dynasties prescribed detailed punishments for every imaginable crime. Beatings with bamboo rods, tattooing criminals' faces, cutting off feet, hands or noses, and of course execution. But before these punishments were carried out, prisoners were sometimes held in wooden stocks or small cells within local magistrates' offices. These spaces were not prisons in the modern sense. They were waiting rooms for pain. What's fascinating is how consistent this pattern was across cultures. Almost no society before the modern era saw long-term imprisonment as a useful punishment. It was expensive, logistically challenging, and didn't offer the immediate deterrent effect that public punishment provided. Instead, justice was fast, brutal, and visible. The real punishment happened in the town square, not behind bars. But as societies grew more complex, as population swelled and legal systems became more bureaucratic, something had to change. You couldn't just flog every criminal and send them home. Some crimes required more deliberation. Some prisoners were valuable, politically connected, or awaiting ransom. And so, slowly, reluctantly, societies began creating spaces specifically designed to hold people, not to punish them, but to contain them while figuring out what punishment they deserved. These early holding spaces were never called prisons. They were dungeons, oubliettes, towers, pits, wells, cages. Each culture invented its own vocabulary for the same basic concept, a place to put someone you didn't want running free, but hadn't yet decided how to punish. And because these spaces were improvised, temporary, and underfunded, they were often far worse than the punishments that followed. Let's talk about the oubliette. The name itself is chilling, derived from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. An oubliette was a dungeon with only one entrance, a trapdoor in the ceiling. Once you were lowered into it, that was it. No doors, no windows, no way out except the hole above your head. Guards didn't visit. Food, if it came at all, was dropped from above. Waste accumulated at the bottom, and prisoners, forgotten, languished in total darkness until they died or went mad. Oubliettes were never meant for long-term imprisonment. They were designed to make someone disappear without the mess of execution. A political rival, an inconvenient noble, someone whose public death would cause problems. You simply dropped them into the oubliette and forgot about them. Hence the name. Out of sight, out of mind, and eventually out of life. Medieval castles across Europe featured these grim chambers. Some were barely large enough to stand in. Others were slightly larger, but still suffocatingly small, carved into bedrock beneath the castle foundations. The cold seeped into your bones, the damp rotted your skin, and the silence, broken only by your own breathing and the distant drip of water, drove men to madness faster than any torture device. The oubliette at Château de Pierrefonds in France still exists today, a dark reminder of medieval justice. Visitors can peer down into it, imagining the terror of being lowered into that absolute darkness. No light ever reached the bottom, no sound escaped. You were buried alive with only the certainty that no one was coming to save you. Some oubliettes were designed with a spike or pointed stone at the bottom. The prisoner, dropped from above, would be impaled immediately, a quick death, merciful by medieval standards. Others had water at the bottom, deep enough that the prisoner had to keep treading water or drown. Eventually, exhaustion won. It was execution disguised as imprisonment, cruelty wrapped in bureaucratic efficiency. The Tower of London, one of history's most famous fortresses, served as both palace and prison. But it wasn't a prison in the modern sense. It was a holding facility for high-value prisoners. Nobles, traders, political enemies, people too important to execute immediately, but too dangerous to release. They were kept in the tower's various chambers, some relatively comfortable, others utterly miserable, until the crown decided their fate. Anne Boleyn spent her final days in the tower, not as punishment, but as a waiting period before her execution. The same with Sir Thomas More, Lady Jane Grey, and countless others. The tower wasn't designed to rehabilitate or reform. It was a royal waiting room for death. The accommodations varied wildly depending on your status and your ability to pay. Wealthy prisoners could rent furnished apartments within the tower walls, complete with servants, books, and decent meals. Poor prisoners were thrown into damp cells barely large enough to lie down in. The tower also housed the infamous torture chamber, though torture was technically illegal in England without royal warrant. That technicality didn't stop it from happening. The rack, the scavenger's daughter, and other devices were employed to extract confessions. The screams echoed through stone corridors, a reminder to other prisoners that their situation could always get worse. But not all prisoners were nobles. Common criminals, the thieves, drunks, brawlers, and petty offenders faced a different system entirely. Many medieval towns had small jails, crude structures often attached to the town hall or local lord's residence. These weren't prisons, they were drunk tanks, holding pens where someone could cool off overnight before being fined, flogged, or released. In England, these local jails were called jails, and they were notoriously filthy. A single room, maybe two, with straw on the floor, no beds, and a bucket for waste. Prisoners weren't separated by crime or severity. A murderer might share space with someone who'd insulted the mayor's wife. Conditions were so bad that diseases like typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, nicknamed jail fever, swept through regularly, killing prisoners and guards alike. The problem with jail fever was that it didn't respect walls or social status. Judges, lawyers, and spectators attending trials in courthouses attached to jails regularly contracted the disease and died. This led to what became known as the Black, assizes where entire courtrooms of people succumbed to infections spread by prisoners being tried. Yet even these deaths didn't prompt immediate reform. The prevailing attitude was that criminals deserved whatever misery befell them, and if some innocent people died along the way, well, that was God's will. Jailers, the men who ran these jails, weren't paid by the government. They were private entrepreneurs who charged prisoners for everything. Want food? Pay the jailer. Want a blanket? Pay the jailer. Want your chains loosened slightly so you can sleep without your wrists bleeding? Pay the jailer. If you had money, jail was uncomfortable but survivable. If you didn't, you starved, froze, or died of infection. This system created a perverse incentive structure. Jailers wanted prisoners to stay as long as possible because they generated revenue. Even after a prisoner's sentence ended or they were acquitted, the jailer could refuse to release them until all fees were paid. Discharge fees, accommodation fees, chain removal fees. The list was endless. Some prisoners, found innocent of all charges, remained in jail for months or years simply because they couldn't afford to leave. Families on the outside sometimes went bankrupt trying to pay these fees. Women and children begged on the streets. holding signs explaining their husband or father was being held despite being cleared of wrongdoing. Charitable organizations occasionally intervened, but the system persisted for centuries because no one in power saw prisoners as deserving of taxpayer money. Why should the government feed and house criminals when private enterprise could handle it? This system, corrupt and brutal as it was, persisted for centuries because societies didn't see the point in funding prisoner care. Why spend tax money feeding criminals when you could just punish them quickly and be done with it? The jail existed only as a temporary necessity, not a solution. Even in colonial America, the pattern continued. Early American settlements had no formal prisons. Instead, they used stocks, pillories, and public whipping posts. Criminals were displayed in the town square, their crimes written on signs hung around their necks. The community saw them, mocked them, sometimes threw vegetables or stones. After a few hours or days, they were released, punishment complete. The stocks locked a person's ankles while they sat on a bench, exposed to public view and public abuse. The pillory was worse, locking the head and hands while the offender stood, unable to protect themselves from whatever the crowd decided to throw. Rotten eggs and vegetables were common, but so were stones. Some offenders lost eyes or teeth. A few died from head injuries. Colonial justice was harsh, visible, and participatory. Everyone in the community had a role to play. But what about serious crimes? Murder, rape, treason. For those, colonial America borrowed from English tradition. Execution, hanging was the most common method, performed publicly, often in the center of town. Crowds gathered, not out of cruelty, but because executions were events, moral lessons, reminders that society had rules, and breaking them had consequences. Before the hanging, the condemned might be held in a small cell, sometimes just a locked room, in the sheriff's house. Again, not as punishment, but as a holding period. And if the prisoner had money, they could buy better conditions. A mattress, better food, even visitors. If they didn't, they sat on the floor and waited for the rope. Execution day was a community affair. Vendors set up stalls selling food and drink. Families brought children who were expected to learn from the spectacle. Ministers gave sermons. The condemned were sometimes allowed to speak, offering confessions, warnings, or final prayers. These speeches were printed and sold as broadsides, early true crime literature consumed eagerly by a public fascinated by the intersection of sin and consequence. Not all executions went smoothly. Ropes broke, sending the condemned crashing to the ground, injured but still alive. Crowds sometimes demanded a reprieve, viewing the failed execution as divine intervention. Other times, the executioner was incompetent, and the condemned strangled slowly rather than dying instantly from a broken neck. These botched executions were horrifying, but did nothing to end the practice. If anything, they added to the morbid fascination. Religious institutions also played a role in pre-prison justice. Monasteries and churches sometimes held prisoners, particularly those accused of heresy or crimes against the church. These weren't trials in the legal sense. They were spiritual interrogations, and the holding cells, small stone rooms within the monastery, were meant to encourage confession and repentance. If you confessed, you might be forgiven, assigned penance, and released. If you didn't, well, the Inquisition had methods for that. The Spanish Inquisition, infamous for its brutality, used imprisonment as a tool of psychological torture. Prisoners were held in dark cells, isolated, uncertain of their fate. The goal wasn't incarceration, it was to break the prisoner's will, force a confession, and then proceed to punishment. Auto da fe, the public ceremony where sentences were announced, often ended in execution. The cell was just the prelude. Inquisition prisons were scattered across Spain and its territories. Some were underground, carved into rock beneath cathedrals. Others were repurposed castles or fortresses. What they shared was secrecy. Families often had no idea where their loved ones were being held or what charges they faced. The Inquisition operated beyond normal legal channels, answerable only to church authority and the crown. Interrogation techniques included sleep deprivation, starvation, and the infamous water torture, where cloth was forced down the prisoner's throat while water was poured over their face, creating the sensation of drowning. If the prisoner confessed under torture, the confession was later repeated without torture present, creating the legal fiction that it was voluntary. This allowed the Inquisition to claim it didn't rely on coerced testimony while absolutely relying on coerced testimony. Even pirates, those romantic outlaws of the seas, faced improvised imprisonment. When captured, pirates were often held in the cargo holds of naval ships or in coastal forts. These weren't prisons, they were holding spaces until the pirate could be tried, usually quickly, and hanged at the nearest port. Piracy was a capital crime, and authorities saw no reason to delay. The trial, if you could call it that, lasted hours. The execution followed shortly after. Pirate trials were performances designed to demonstrate state power over lawless seas. Defendants had no real chance of acquittal. Evidence was presented by naval officers, merchant captains, and survivors of pirate attacks. The accused, often in chains, could barely speak in their own defense. Witnesses for the defense were rarely called, and if they were, their testimony was dismissed as lies told by fellow criminals. After conviction, pirates were hanged at the docks, often at low tide so their bodies would be submerged twice by rising water before being taken down. This was considered symbolically appropriate, the sea claiming what had lived by the sea. Some pirate corpses were covered in tar and hung in metal cages called gibbets, left to rot as warnings to other sailors. These gibbets swayed in the wind for months, sometimes years, until nothing remained but bones and rusted iron. But not every prisoner faced execution. Some faced something arguably worse: exile. Throughout history, exile served as a common punishment for crimes that didn't warrant death but couldn't be ignored. Ancient Athens exiled political rivals through ostracism, a democratic vote where citizens scratched names onto pottery. Shards. If your name appeared most frequently, you had 10 days to leave Athens for 10 years. No trial, no appeal, just the will of the people removing you from the city. Rome banished troublesome citizens to remote islands. The poet Ovid was exiled to Thomas on the Black Sea, where he spent the last decade of his life writing mournful poetry about his isolation and longing for Rome. The Emperor Tiberius used exile ruthlessly, sending rivals, inconvenient relatives, and political threats to desolate islands, where they lived under guard, cut off from Roman society, but not quite imprisoned. Medieval kingdoms sent criminals to distant territories, often with the understanding that they'd never return. Exile didn't require prisons, it required distance. You simply removed the problem from society and forgot about it. The criminal became someone else's problem, or no one's at all. Many exiled prisoners died trying to survive in unfamiliar lands. Others formed communities of outcasts. A few, remarkably, thrived. But the point was the same: out of sight, out of mind. Iceland was famously settled partly by Norwegian exiles, men who'd been banished for crimes ranging from murder to political dissent. They brought their families, their skills, and their grudges to a harsh volcanic island where survival demanded cooperation despite old feuds. The Icelandic sagas are filled with stories of these exiled communities, their complex honor codes, and their bloody resolutions to disputes that had begun in Norway generations earlier. One of the strangest examples of improvised imprisonment comes from ancient Sparta. The Spartans, obsessed with military discipline and efficiency, had no patience for long-term incarceration. Serious crimes resulted in immediate execution. But for lesser offenses, Sparta used a unique punishment, the kaiadas, a deep pit into which criminals were thrown. It wasn't a prison, it was a mass grave. You didn't survive the kaiadas, you simply ceased to exist. Archaeological excavations of the kaiadas have revealed human remains dating back thousands of years, confirming ancient accounts of this brutal practice. The victims weren't just criminals. Some were deformed infants, deemed unfit for Spartan society and disposed of without ceremony. Sparta's ruthless pragmatism extended to every aspect of life and death. Even Sparta's feared secret police, the Cryptia, didn't imprison their targets. They hunted, stalked, and killed. Young Spartan warriors were sent into the countryside to track and eliminate helots, the enslaved population who showed signs of rebellion or leadership potential. This wasn't considered murder, it was considered training, a way to harden young men while maintaining social control through terror. In medieval Islamic societies, justice followed Sharia law, which prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes. Theft might result in amputation, adultery could lead to stoning, murder demanded blood money or execution. But Islamic law also recognized the concept of tazir, discretionary punishment decided by a judge. This sometimes included imprisonment, though rarely for long periods. Islamic jails, where they existed, were simple structures. A room, often within the local governor's compound, where prisoners awaited trial or punishment. Some were underground, others at ground level, but windowless. The goal was containment, not correction. And because Islamic law emphasized swift justice, prisoners rarely stayed long. Trials were conducted quickly, sentences announced, and punishments carried out. Interestingly, some Islamic scholars debated whether imprisonment was even permissible under Sharia. They argued that holding someone indefinitely without clear Quranic justification was unjust. The Quran prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes, and prolonged imprisonment wasn't among them. So imprisonment remained a temporary measure used sparingly, and always with the understanding that real punishment would follow. The Ottoman Empire developed a more sophisticated system. Major cities had prisons, some quite large, where criminals and political prisoners were held. The Seven Towers prison in Constantinople held foreign ambassadors during diplomatic disputes, a practice that horrified European powers but was considered acceptable leverage in Ottoman statecraft. Conditions varied wildly depending on the prisoner status, the political climate, and the whim of local administrators. By the Middle Ages, Europe began developing a rudimentary prison system, though it still wasn't punishment-based. Debtors' prisons emerged, places where people who owed money were held until they paid their debts. This system was absurd. If you couldn't pay your debts outside prison, how were you supposed to pay them inside? Yet debtors' prisons persisted for centuries, trapping people in cycles of poverty and incarceration. The logic, if it can be called that, was that imprisonment would motivate the debtor's family and friends to raise money for their release. In practice, it often impoverished entire families. Wives and children were left without support, while the breadwinner sat in prison. Some debtors spent decades behind bars, their original debt far exceeded by the fees charged by jailers. Charles Dickens' father was imprisoned for debt in London's Marshalsea prison. Young Charles, just 12 years old, was forced to leave school and work in a bootblacking factory to help support the family. He visited his father regularly, witnessing firsthand the squalor, despair, and injustice of the system. Entire families sometimes moved into debtors' prisons, living in squalid rooms, creating a bizarre community of the financially ruined. That experience shaped Dickens's writing and fueled his lifelong criticism of debtors' prisons. His novels, particularly Little Dorrit and David Copperfield, exposed the system's cruelty to a wide audience. Public opinion slowly turned, but despite outcry and reform movements, debtors' prisons continued well into the 19th century. They weren't finally abolished in England until 1869. The Fleet Prison in London was another notorious debtors' prison, operating for over 5 centuries. It gained a reputation for corruption, with jailers running an internal economy where everything had a price. Want to live in the nicer section? Pay more. Want to avoid the worst abuse? Pay more. The prison even had a tavern inside, run by the jailer, where prisoners with money could drink themselves into oblivion while waiting for financial salvation that rarely came. The concept of imprisonment as punishment, rather than merely holding people before punishment, began shifting during the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria argued that punishment should be proportional, humane, and focused on deterrence rather than brutality. His 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments challenged the use of torture and capital punishment, suggesting that consistent, moderate punishment would better serve society than spectacular executions. Beccaria's work influenced reformers across Europe and America. He argued that certainty of punishment deterred crime more effectively than severity. A system where criminals knew they would definitely be caught and punished, even mildly, was more effective than one where punishment was harsh, but enforcement spotty. This was revolutionary thinking in an age where torture and execution were considered normal tools of justice. Other Enlightenment thinkers joined the debate. Voltaire criticized the arbitrary nature of French justice. Montesquieu argued that law should be designed to fit the society they governed. not imported blindly from tradition. John Howard, an English philanthropist, toured prisons across Europe and documented the horrific conditions in his book, The State of the Prisons in England and Wales, published in 1777. His work shocked readers and sparked early prison reform movements. This philosophical shift laid the groundwork for modern prisons. But the transition was slow, uneven, and marked by terrible experiments in human suffering. Throughout the 18th century, most prisoners were still held in horrific conditions, treated as less than human, and subjected to punishments that modern sensibilities would find barbaric. In the American colonies, the Quakers pioneered a new approach. They believed criminals could be reformed through isolation, reflection, and religious instruction. This led to the creation of the penitentiary, a place where prisoners did penance for their crimes. The name itself reveals the philosophy, a place for penitence, for spiritual transformation through suffering and contemplation. The Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, established in 1790, became one of the first true prisons in the modern sense. It wasn't perfect, conditions were still harsh, but it represented a philosophical shift. Crime wasn't just an offense. Against society, it was a moral failing that could be corrected. The prisoner's soul could be saved through isolation, Bible study, and hard labor. This approach expanded into the Pennsylvania system, implemented at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Opened in 1829, it was architecturally stunning. Radial wings extending from a central hub, each cell designed for complete isolation. Prisoners lived alone, worked alone, exercised alone in small individual yards, shaped like circles with high walls, so they could see only sky. They saw no one but guards and occasional visiting clergy. The idea was beautiful in theory. In practice, it was psychological torture. Men went insane. The isolation, the silence, the endless hours alone with nothing but stone walls and their own minds, it broke them. Some became catatonic, sitting motionless for days. Others hallucinated, having conversations with people who weren't there. Suicide attempts were common, and the methods available were horrifyingly creative given the sparse furnishings. Charles Dickens visited Eastern State in 1842 and was horrified. He described the system as cruel and wrong, arguing that the mental anguish inflicted was worse than physical punishment. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body, he wrote. His criticism carried weight, but it didn't stop the system's spread. Yet the Pennsylvania system was celebrated internationally. European countries sent observers to study it. More than 300 prisons worldwide were built using its radial design. The architecture itself became iconic, a model that influenced prison construction into the 20th century. And the underlying philosophy, that isolation could reform, lingered long after the worst abuses were acknowledged and supposedly corrected. Competing with the Pennsylvania system was the Auburn system, developed at Auburn State Prison in New York. Auburn took a different approach. Prisoners were held in solitary cells at night, but worked together during the day in complete silence. They couldn't speak, couldn't make eye contact, couldn't communicate in any way. Guards enforced silence with brutal efficiency. Breaking the rule meant whipping, or worse, time in the dark cell, a pitch-black isolation chamber where prisoners were left for days on bread and water. The Auburn system was cheaper to implement than Pennsylvania's total isolation. It allowed for congregate labor, which was more productive and profitable. Prison workshops produced goods that were sold, generating revenue for the state. And it became the dominant model for American prisons throughout the 19th century, spreading westward as the country expanded. But it was still deeply dehumanizing. Prisoners became silent, obedient automatons stripped of identity, voice, and agency. They marched in lockstep, heads turned in the same direction, arms at their sides, a choreography of submission. Guards watched for any deviation, any sign of personality or resistance. Prisoners who made eye contact with each other received lashes. Those caught whispering faced the dungeon. Both systems shared a core belief that prisoners were morally corrupted and needed to be broken down and rebuilt. The process was cruel, but proponents argued it was necessary. Better to suffer in silence and emerge reformed than to be publicly flogged and released unchanged. This paternalistic attitude, the idea that the state knew what was best for the criminal's soul, justified enormous cruelty disguised as care. Meanwhile, Britain faced a different problem. What do you do with tens of thousands of criminals when your jails are overflowing, public executions are losing popular support, and you need to maintain order across a growing empire? The answer was transportation. Ship them away. Britain had been sending convicts to American colonies since the 17th century. They were sold as indentured servants, their labor purchased by colonists who needed workers. But after the American Revolution, that option vanished. The newly independent United States wanted nothing to do with British criminals. So Britain looked further, much further, Australia. Between 1787 and 1868, over 160,000 convicts were transported to Australian penal colonies. The journey itself was brutal. Months at sea in filthy, overcrowded ships where disease spread rapidly, scurvy, typhus, dysentery, all thrived in the cramped conditions below deck. Many died before reaching land. Those who survived faced hard labor, harsh climates, and a society built on punishment and control. The first fleet, which arrived in Botany Bay in 1788, carried about 780 convicts. They'd survived a journey of over 24,000 kilometers lasting 8 months. Upon arrival, they found a land unlike anything they'd known. Strange animals, unfamiliar plants, indigenous peoples whose presence complicated the British claim of terra nullius, empty land. The convicts were immediately put to work building the infrastructure of the colony, a prison camp that would eventually become a nation. Australia wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It was an entire continent turned into a penal colony. Convicts weren't locked in cells. They were assigned labor, often to free settlers who essentially owned them for the duration of their sentence. The work was backbreaking, clearing land, building roads, constructing buildings, all in brutal heat with minimal tools and inadequate food. Some were sent to secondary punishment sites like Port Arthur in Tasmania, where conditions were even harsher. Port Arthur was reserved for repeat offenders, those who'd committed crimes in Australia after being transported. It was a prison within a prison, isolated on a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land, guarded by dogs and soldiers. The surrounding waters were shark-infested. Escape was nearly impossible. The ocean was the ultimate wall. Yet, transportation, brutal as it was, offered something imprisonment didn't: a future. After serving their sentence, many convicts became free settlers. They were granted land, built lives, started families, and contributed to the colony's growth. Some became wealthy and prominent. Francis Greenway, a convict transported for forgery, became one of Australia's most celebrated architects, designing buildings that still stand today. Transportation was punishment, yes, but it wasn't purely destructive. It displaced, it exploited, but it also paradoxically created opportunity. This made it unique in the history of criminal justice. Nowhere else did punishment offer such a strange mixture of suffering and possibility. Still, by the mid-19th century, attitudes were shifting. Transportation was expensive, logistically complex, and increasingly seen as inhumane. The Australian colonies, growing in population and confidence, resented being used as dumping grounds for British criminals. Local settlers wanted to attract free immigrants, not convicts. The system ended officially in 1868, and Britain began building more prisons at home, investing in the infrastructure needed to house long-term prisoners. The age of the modern prison was beginning, but even as prisons became more common, the philosophy behind them remained confused. Were they for punishment, deterrence, reform, revenge? Different countries, different institutions, even different wardens within the same system had wildly different answers. This confusion persists today, reflected in debates about whether prisons should be harsh or comfortable, focused on punishment or rehabilitation. Some prisons focused on religion. Chaplains preached daily. Prisoners were required to attend services, memorize scripture, and confess their sins. The goal was moral transformation through faith. Guards reported that the most troublesome prisoners often became model inmates after religious conversion, though whether this reflected genuine spiritual change or learned survival behavior is debatable. Others focused on labor. Prisoners broke rocks, sewed uniforms, built roads. The work was hard, dangerous, and poorly compensated, but it kept them busy, generated revenue for the state, and theoretically taught discipline. Chain gangs became common in the American South after the Civil War, primarily used to control formerly enslaved people through the criminal justice system. Men shackled together worked on public roads, their labor leased to private companies in a system that resembled slavery in everything but name. Still others experimented with education. A few progressive reformers argued that most criminals were products of poverty and ignorance. Teach them to read, give them a trade, and they might leave prison as productive citizens. It was a radical idea, and it gained little traction in the 19th century. Punishment, not education, was the priority. Why waste resources teaching criminals when that money could go to law-abiding citizens? Women's prisons developed differently, and often later than men's. Female prisoners were often housed in separate wings of male prisons, supervised by male guards, and subjected to horrific abuse. Sexual assault was common and rarely punished. Pregnancy in prison was frequent, and the resulting children were sometimes raised behind bars until they were old enough to be sent to orphanages. Women were also punished for crimes that reflected gendered expectations. Prostitution, adultery, bearing children out of wedlock, these were crimes for women, but not men. The justice system reflected and reinforced patriarchal control, using imprisonment to discipline women who violated social norms even when they hadn't broken actual laws. It wasn't until the late 19th century that female-only institutions began emerging, staffed by women and designed with at least a minimal acknowledgement of gender-specific needs. Elizabeth Fry, an English Quaker, pioneered prison reform for women. She visited Newgate Prison in London in 1813 and was appalled by conditions. Women and children were crammed together in filth, with no privacy, no sanitation, and no supervision beyond male guards, who often exploited them. Fry organized the women, established a school for the children, provided meaningful work, and advocated for systemic reform. Her work inspired similar efforts across Europe and America. Women's prisons slowly improved, though they remained harsh by modern standards. The philosophy behind them was different too. Women's criminality was seen as moral failure requiring maternal guidance and domestic training. Female prisoners were taught sewing, cooking, and childcare, preparing them for their proper role as wives and mothers upon release. Juvenile justice also lagged behind. For most of history, children who committed crimes were treated as small adults. They faced the same punishments, the same prisons, the same brutality. A 10-year-old thief could be hanged alongside adult murderers. No one questioned this. Childhood, as a distinct phase of development requiring different treatment, wasn't really recognized. It wasn't until the early 20th century that societies began creating separate systems for juvenile offenders. Juvenile detention centers, reform schools, and youth courts slowly emerged. But even these institutions often replicated the cruelty of adult prisons. Children were beaten, isolated, forced into hard labor, and subjected to experimental treatments designed to correct their supposedly criminal nature. The 20th century brought waves of reform, or at least attempts at reform. Progressive movements pushed for better conditions, prisoner rights, and rehabilitation programs. Psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists studied crime, trying to understand its causes and design better responses. Some prisons introduced education programs, vocational training, therapy, and parole systems that recognized prisoners as humans capable of change. But progress was uneven, inconsistent, and often reversed. For every reform-minded institution, there were a dozen brutal, overcrowded, underfunded prisons where violence, corruption, and despair ruled. Alcatraz, America's most famous prison, opened in 1934 as a maximum security facility for the country's most dangerous criminals. It was escape-proof, famously isolated on an island in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing water and strong currents. Life in Alcatraz was strictly regimented. Silence was enforced. Privileges were minimal. The goal was punishment and containment, not rehabilitation. Guards and administrators believed that the worst criminals deserved the worst conditions. After 29 years, Alcatraz closed in 1963, too expensive to maintain and increasingly controversial as attitudes shifted toward rehabilitation. And even today, in the 21st century, the debate continues. What is the purpose of prison? Should it punish, rehabilitate, protect society, deter crime, Or all of these? Different countries have different answers. Norway's prisons focus heavily on rehabilitation, with comfortable conditions, education programs, and low recidivism rates. American prisons often prioritize punishment, with harsh conditions, long sentences, and high rates of reoffending. Both systems cost enormous amounts of money. Both claim to serve justice. Neither is perfect. What's clear is this: for thousands of years, societies managed crime without long-term imprisonment. They used pain, shame, exile, and death. Public floggings, brandings, mutilations, executions, these were the norm. Imprisonment was temporary, a waiting period before the real punishment. When prisons finally emerged as punishment in themselves, they weren't initially designed with noble goals. They were experiments, sometimes well-intentioned, often disastrous. The Pennsylvania system tortured men psychologically. The Auburn system dehumanized them. Transportation created a strange colonial project built on suffering. Debtors' prisons destroyed families. Women's and children's prisons reflected the worst prejudices of their eras. It took centuries of experimentation, philosophy, public outcry, and horror to develop the modern prison system. And even now, it's deeply flawed, overcrowded, expensive, racially biased, often ineffective at preventing reoffending. We've come a long way from throwing criminals into pits and forgetting about them, but we still haven't figured out the perfect solution. Maybe there isn't one. As you drift off tonight, think about those forgotten souls locked in dungeons, pits, and cells throughout history, waiting in darkness for punishments that would define them, break them, or end them. They weren't prisoners in the modern sense. They were echoes of a justice system that valued spectacle over rehabilitation, fear over reform, immediate consequences over long-term solutions. The medieval thief waiting in a dungeon for his flogging. The debtor trapped in prison, unable to pay the fees that would free him. The convict on a ship bound for Australia, seasick and terrified. The woman in an oubliette, lowered into darkness and forgotten. The child in colonial stocks, pelted with stones for stealing bread. They all share one thing. They were human beings caught in systems that saw them as problems to be solved, not people to be helped. And in many ways, those echoes still linger in the prisons we build today. We've replaced dungeons with concrete cells, but we haven't fully answered the fundamental question. What do we owe people who break our laws? Punishment, rehabilitation, revenge, forgiveness, or something else entirely, something we haven't yet imagined? The history of imprisonment is the history of that question, asked over and over across millennia, answered differently by every culture, every era, every society, and the question remains open, waiting for each generation to try again, to build something better, something more just, something more human. Until then, the ghosts of history's prisoners linger in the stones of forgotten dungeons, in the ruins of abandoned penitentiaries, in the records of trials and executions and transportations. They whisper a reminder. That justice, however we define it, always comes with a cost, and those who pay that cost are often the ones history forgets first.